morning. It's April 8th, 2022. Welcome to Triggered. I'm Cory Morgan. Yes, it's Friday. We're almost to the weekend. This is, for those who are new to the show, this is the Western Standard's daily live show. We come Monday to Friday, 11:30 a.m. Mountain Standard Time and run until usually about 1 p.m. Depends on how the guest conversations go and how the subjects are. It's good to see you all out there. That reminder, I see the commenters coming in already. We are a live show, and I encourage commentary. Yesterday there was some good discussion going back and forth between some of the people on the comment scroll with each other. I mean, you don't always just have to put questions to me or to the guests. You can chat with each other, and again, put those things forward. Just try to remain civil. As Nico has put, I see at the bottom, Cory B. Morgan. That's my Twitter handle. If we really want to get rough and tumble, that's the place to go. We can have some discourse there, of course, and I do encourage tweets and following me on Twitter, and we can get a little rougher. But here in the comments, let's just try and have a good conversation while we're going. I got a couple of really good guests coming up today, and hey there, Dash and Margaret and Rose. I got Peter Menzies. He's the former vice chair of the CRTC, and he was a publisher of the Calgary Herald, a man very well established in Canadian journalism and the regulation of journalism for a long time. And he's going to talk to us about Bill C-18 and some of the controls we've had put on media and attempted controls going further. It's not a good trend. Things are not looking very good, and the Liberals are really out to put the screws to the social media providers. I know not too many people feel sorry for Facebook and Google. They're large social media giants, but all the same, we aren't doing ourselves favors by attacking them and trying to force them to pay out on certain journalists. And that's things, certain ones, not all of them. I suspect we wouldn't be among the preferred journalists. And after that, I am going to talk to Franco Terrazzano. Of course, I think pretty much everybody expected Franco would have to come on. He's a regular guest, a friend of the show. He's with the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. And yesterday we did have our federal budget released. It was kind of a lot as predicted, a lot of fluff, a whole lot of spending, and a heck of a lot of debt. Franco's going to break all that down for us, and we will discuss our federal budget on what the Liberals plan on doing with your money for the next year. And among that budget, that's kind of what brings about a bit of what I'm going to rant about and what I'm triggered by today. And that's housing, which is clearly the top priority in the big spending Liberal budget that was dropped yesterday. I mean, the word housing appeared and it was used 231 times in that budget document. Of course, shelter is a need. And when we're living in the Canadian environment, it's really pointing out the obvious when it's saying a need. Inflation, on the other hand, is only used 86 times within the budget, though it's an issue on top of mind for many Canadians. The rising cost of housing has put a lot of pressure on Canadians right now. So the word supply is used in the budget 114 times. So if we look at these words, one would hope that governments kind of realize that the way to reduce the cost of housing is to increase the supply. And some statements within the budget do actually acknowledge that. But once one reads into how the government intends to address the lack of supply, however, it becomes clear that they still just don't get it. The budget calls for dumping $72 billion tax dollars into the market to address housing issues over the next 6 years. And as usual, the government's solution to a problem is to blindly toss money at it rather than try to address the underlying issues at the bottom of things. So it's not terribly surprising that a government that's led by a man who said budgets balance themselves. Government spending and borrowing spawns inflation. This isn't economic theory. This is economic law. So as we continue to run huge deficits while dumping money into a market, the government's actually going to make housing even less affordable for people. This won't be too damaging for the people who have already gotten into the market and they're paying off their mortgages. Inflation will simply increase the dollar value of their homes. But as long as their mortgage debt remains the same, they're fine. But that's not everybody. Renters and prospective new home buyers are going to be the ones paying the price for these bad government policies. I mean, if we want to increase housing supply, we need government to get out of the damn way, and on a number of levels. Municipal governments across the country have been dominated by ideologues fixated upon increasing urban density. These politicians purposely strangle outward development in their cities, and this causes housing shortages. They also stack a ridiculous amount of regulation upon developers and builders, which shoots the costs through the roof. In Calgary, it takes 8 years for a development to go from concept to construction, and that's assuming it doesn't get rejected at some point during the countless studies and permit applications which are required. And yes, they get rejected often and regularly. So municipal deregulation would do wonders for increasing housing supply. Now, it isn't within the spectrum of the federal government, though they should understand that. They do talk about working with municipal governments, though, and they should work with them to get their regulations under control, which would be much more effective in increasing supply than pouring tax dollars into the issue will. The government document does address working with municipalities, but it actually calls for them to encourage them to build even denser neighborhoods. Now, the most affordable housing in North America is always in the least dense jurisdictions. While Phoenix, Houston, and Las Vegas, they all have reasonable housing prices. Manhattan, San Francisco, Boston, they're some of the most expensive on earth, and it's no coincidence. Allowing outward growth helps keep housing affordable. An obsession with urban density is not having the effect the government claims it will, and it's been rather well proven. The government plan calls for funding for more cooperative housing as well. And this is a band-aid solution, and it certainly will help some people who are in need, but it doesn't do a thing for the general lack of supply. If the state goes further into directly building housing, we're going to see slums. And that's been well proven already as well. Drive through projects in any large American city to see how well that turns out. I mean, if you go south of Niagara Falls and through Buffalo, New York, look at all those nice big brick row housing and building in there and see how well when things go when the government takes care of housing. Tax relief and deregulation in industries that support home building could bring down costs. I mean, in other areas, we could do the same to help out. I mean, let's open up more regions for logging. We have some of the most abundant lumber resources on the planet, yet our costs for wooden building materials are as high as any other nation on the world. I'm not talking about clear cutting the entire country with wild abandon, but we've put such gross levels of environmental controls upon our operations that many areas just aren't worth logging or developing. Again, we're going to get back to that supply issue. Energy, of course, is another big element. Carbon taxes and efforts to strangle conventional energy development increase the cost of everything. And that includes material required in home building, everything from cement to shingles. If we reduce energy costs, we reduce home construction costs. Government and regulation are the problem, not the solution. The government's managed to recognize that there is a problem, but they've come up with the opposite of a solution. I truly feel for those who've been saving and hoping to buy a new home, or those with fixed incomes right now who are trying to make rent payments. Their situation is only going to get worse thanks to a fiscally incompetent government, and there's not going to be a sign of relief for some years to come. Of course, this may not be the actions of an incompetent government. This may be exactly what they want to do. If we want to expand the welfare state and increase the number of dependents living in government housing, well, this was a great step towards that end. And that does make people start thinking about some of the agendas in the World Economic Forum and things that Justin Trudeau has said he admires. This budget was a disappointment on many levels, particularly for people, the ones who were most in need of financial relief. But again, it wasn't terribly surprising. Well, let's check into the top news items of the day. We've got Eva Sidik coming in from the newsroom, and she'll talk about some things other than my ranting on the housing. How's it going, Eva?
Good. How are you, Cory?
Oh, good.
Yeah, I'm also worried about housing. I'm trying to look for a house, but it's not turning out very much in my price range in Calgary at the moment. So very much on my mind and many Canadians.
Yes.
In the news today, we got lots on the 2022 budget that came out yesterday afternoon. A lot of articles and opinion pieces breaking down what that means for Canadians. Like you said, Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland said yesterday that housing sustainability and affordability is going to be addressed by spending billions on permits systems, affordable housing construction, and payments to those who are struggling to make ends meet. The budget will continue electric vehicle rebates as well to continue to try encouraging Canadians to drive electric, but the program has been reviewed as costly and ineffective. In 2022, banks and insurers will pay higher taxes. This was announced by Freeland in an effort to pay off Canada's extraordinary debts. The CTF says that the real result of this will be higher bank fees for Canadians. In the House of Commons, MPs are helping to protect Quebec from losing one seat as the province's growth lags behind others. We got lots of comments from MPs on that in that article. We also have an opinion piece up pointing out how Freeland talks about the federal budget covered climate change and Ukraine, but it did not mention inflation, like you mentioned earlier, which is what most Canadians are really worried about. We have COVID updates from Saskatchewan. The health officer said, made announcements on COVID numbers and case counts right now, and it says they are not in a sixth wave. The leader of the Buffalo Party in Saskatchewan is calling out the Prime Minister, the Premier, and the United Nations on various issues, saying that politics has lost its common sense, which I think is a very interesting statement to make about politics. I also have an article up which I dove into the latest Pfizer documents, which were going to be withheld until 2076. It shows that in less than 3 months after countries around the world approved the vax, over 41,000 cases with over 150,000 adverse events were reported. Pfizer then concluded that those to be theoretical risks, which did not provide enough data to make conclusions on vaccine safety. In upcoming news, we have more about the fallout from the federal budget, and we also have some transgender focused stories. I'll be doing one on British cycling, which is now banning transgender and non-binaries, non-binary people from participating in the women rider events because it poses an unfair challenge and risks to integrity of the sport. Another one, out of the Liberal budget, they will include menstrual integrity to women, girls, transgender, and non-binary persons, which is interesting because now menstrual products will be available to all Canadians regardless of their gender. This hasn't been seen before. I think it's a great thing to have menstrual products provided for people who have no choice but to menstruate. But our reporter Amanda even looked into how transgender women can stimulate a period, which is interesting. So even if you don't have it naturally, you can still...
Stimulate, I suspect, is what you meant there.
Oh, simulate.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
that's what we call
lots of stuff, but
yeah, so you can simulate your own period, and then the government can provide you products to help you.
Well, and I think that's only fair. I mean, we're all taxpayers here, and I don't intend on simulating any periods. But I mean, if we're going to be buying products for everybody and gender doesn't matter anymore, I should be entitled to my fair share of maxi pads and whatever other products typically I haven't bothered with over these years. I mean, it's only equity, isn't it?
I guess so. I mean, maybe for me, but for other people who don't menstruate naturally, I don't know about that. So that's what we got in upcoming news.
Okay. Well, lots to look forward to. I appreciate the update today, Eva, and we'll talk to you later.
Thanks, Cory.
Great, thanks. Yes, that awkward subject that makes us males always put our fingers into our ears. As I was kind of saying in our newsroom discussion this morning, we prefer to live in our denial that those issues even happen to women out there, but we do have to admit it. But boy, 25 million a year, guys, to address that. And yes, the language within the budget on that is something else. It makes sure that you cover every possible conceivable letter of the alphabet wherever things are these days with the alphabet people. And that's kind of the point where you got to get calling it now, because it just seems when you catch up on the amount of genders there's supposed to be, they come up with a few more. So I'll just, relate to the alphabet. I mean, LGBTQ used to cover it. Funny, going way back to, I'll talk some political history before we move on with our next guest there. Actually, no, I'm going to talk about our news first. I see Nico is ahead of the game here. We still got to pay our bills. Despite that, those subsidized products that are going to be coming our way, the Western Standard still relies on a number of things to pay our bills, and that's subscribers. And subscribers have been fantastic. They help us remain independent. They help us pay our bills. It's things like I'm going to be talking about with our first guest here. When you are beholden to somebody to pay your bills, when they start funding you, chances are you're going to lean towards, doing what they tell you. Well, we do what our subscribers tell us. We are responsive to our subscribers. That's how we stay independent. And if you haven't subscribed already, guys, come on, get on there, take it out. As you can see with the coupon code there, if you put in triggered when you take out your subscription, you'll save $10. And for $99 a year, it's $10 a month if you want to go month to month, $99 for a year. This is the kind of costs we were talking about paying for a newspaper subscription in the past. now it's just a digital online thing. People aren't used to paying for things online. Sometimes they chafe at it, but you got to put it in the right perspective. You're paying for a service, and we really appreciate it. And we've been spreading out. We've got new reporters in Ottawa, in Edmonton, in BC, Saskatchewan. We're really broadening our ability to provide good news content for you guys out there, and some real professionals in here. So thank you all who've subscribed already. And if you haven't subscribed yet, get on there and take out a subscription. As well, I may as well speak to one of our sponsors, because that's the thing. The more subscribers we have, the more sponsors we'll get, because we are capitalists. And Bitcoin Well is one of our primary sponsors. They were one of our first big sponsors here at the Western Standard, really allowed us to up our game. I mean, it's hard to believe this publication's only 2.5 years old, but really coming along. And Bitcoin Well really helped in that growth. And they provide a fantastic service. If you're looking into getting into digital currencies, into that, as I said, nebulous, weird world of it, I mean, it's growing. You keep hearing about it in the news, but for some of us who are getting a little older, it sounds a little strange. You get a little nervous. Bitcoin Well is a Western Canadian company that will help you navigate those digital currency waters. I mean, that's their whole role, is facilitating your involvement, whether you're looking for a big investment, a small one, whether you're looking to pay bills with Bitcoin online, or even use one of the hundreds of ATMs they've got now for Bitcoin all across Canada. These guys facilitate it. And again, they educate. There's a lot. They've got Bitcoin Academy, they call it, on there to show you what it's all about. And it's safe. It's non-custodial. They never handle your Bitcoin. It's always yours. They are just the ones helping you through the process. So check them out. And maybe it's not for you. That's the thing. It's there to educate. And perhaps that's not the way you want to go. But it's the way I wanted to go. And I've gotten involved with getting some Bitcoin. I'll go on about that later when I talk to the sponsor a little later. But bitcoinwell.com, guys, they're a good service. They're a Canadian service. Check them out. So that story I interrupted myself with before I get to my guest there, I'm looking forward to, Peter Menzies. But if people remember, like, I used to be on the Wild Rose Party executive. I was very politically involved in the past. And there was an AGM shortly before Danielle Smith crossed the floor. The party was in a lot of internal turmoil. There was a lot of problems going on. And 2 years in a row at these AGMs, we kept getting these motions from people who felt if we just fed the woke enough, if we just bent over enough and made sure that we accommodate and address everybody, that we would never suffer from these issues. So we had this policy put forward 2 years in a row that talked about how we have to affirm and recognize the rights of the LGBTQ community. And back then, that was the only letters that was involved in it. And it was shot down both times with members. And both times, of course, I mean, it was idiotic to put the policy out there in the first place, because no other party had that. You don't have to say that. Look, affirm equity, equality for everybody. There, simple, it's done. And follow up with it, of course. Practice it. Be that way. But part of the issue, when you start picking and choosing who you're going to address, which ones, then you're going to exclude somebody somewhere else. And that was part of the rationale. We shot ourselves in the foot as a party back and forth. Again, not so much in voting down those policies. We shot ourselves in the feet by putting forward in the first place. But now that we look at it, the case that some people made from the floor, they said, we can't do this because if we do LGBTQ this year, it'll be LGBTQ something else next year, and we'll be out of date and we'll be accused of excluding people. Well, that was prescient, because now, I mean, I can't keep up with the amount of numbers and alphabet to keep up. I mean, there's two S and XYZ, and I don't know. I mean, I want to respect everybody. I really do. Whatever their orientation is and whatever they identify as a gender, go for it. But come on, guys, we just can't address each and every possible thing, non-binary this and that. Yet here we are with a federal government policy now that addresses all of those things and provides menstruation products for them. So there's your tax dollars at work, guys. On those high priority issues for everybody. But what would the world be if we didn't dip into those realms? Okay, I'm going to bring our next guest in, actually our first guest in. I've been looking forward to this. This is Mr. Peter Menzies, and he's been, again, a very established individual in media in Canada for quite some time. I don't like, trying to age people or insult them so much, but he's been established for a number of decades, and as a publisher of the Calgary Herald, as the vice chair of the CRTC, which is the Canadian Radio and Telecommunications Commission. And he's been very outspoken about some of the government policies regarding media and the CRTC lately, particularly now with C18. So let's bring Peter in and discuss a bit of that. Hey, how's it going?
Great. Thanks for having me on your show.
Oh, I really appreciate it. You're, of course, very well placed to speak to these issues of concern that are kind of rising up. I mean, we've seen this for a few years. The government just seems to be more focused than ever to just try to control. I mean, even if perhaps they mean well with some of these things, the outcomes of some of these bills and acts could be pretty bad, particularly C-18.
Yeah, well, like Grandpa used to say, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, right? Yeah, they've got C-18 came in this week. Prior to that, C-11, which was a year ago called C-10 before the government fell, was reintroduced. We've still got the online harms bill to come. The government seems very determined to control the internet, and that kind of makes me sad because the internet is such a dynamic and wonderful thing. Yes, it has problems. Yes, there are issues with it. Yes, there are areas that, in terms of privacy, data collection, and that sort of stuff with big tech that you want to look at for regulation. But these guys are kind of funny. They keep saying that free speech will be protected in one breath, and in the next breath they say, well, we have to do this to stop disinformation. So one of the things you have to live with free speech is a certain amount of disinformation. So there you go. That's you're looking down three barrels at the moment, and I'm really quite concerned that the interaction between funding for media and that sort of stuff is going to interfere with the debate.
Well, that's something I was kind of ranting about before. I mean, in a bit of a self-serving way, but it's the truth. What you're going to be beholden to whoever pays your bills, and if that turns out to be the government at some point, well, then chances are you're going to be a lot less inclined to be critical of the government at the time because you just don't want that boat to be rocked.
Right. I mean, Bill C-18, for your viewers and listeners who aren't familiar with it, it forces big tech companies like Facebook and LinkedIn and Google to pay money to news organizations. Not just any news organizations, but approved news organizations that the federal government has set up a panel to approve what is a real news organization and what isn't a real news organization. That's you guys applied for that just to see what would happen. You got a couple raised eyebrows, but a nod, and then you politely declined to take the cash. Which I think speaks well of you, because as a former newspaper man, I'm shocked at the extent to which today's publishers are willing to accept this contradiction in their independence, to their independence like that. Anyway, C-18 forces the Facebook, etc., to feed money to these companies for a fantasy commercial exchange, and it really puts the big publishers in the pocket of the government, in not directly, but indirectly enough that it's going to undermine their credibility with their readers and listeners.
Well, absolutely. I mean, they're kind of pointing out. Some pointed back and said, "Well, see, the standard qualified. They're not unfair as a committee." But the thing was, if we had accepted that, and then we became dependent on that shakedown, as the term has been put, for the social media giants to get that money, well, we are always going to be fearful, though, of losing our status as an approved media outlet. So, I mean, if that rug could be yanked out from under us at any given time, we're not going to be fully independent, and we're going to always have that in the back of our minds, even if unintentional, when reporting on anything, and that's not good.
Yeah, and even if you are pure as the driven snow, people who consume your product will wonder if you are, right? So, like, these conflicts of interest, like, really interesting going back, been involved in a few of these. You hear people say, "Hey, I know when I'm in a conflict of interest. I'm okay. It doesn't matter that this story is about the priest at the church I went to. I can still report on it fairly." Well, perhaps you can, but the point is you should not, because other people will think you can't, and that's the way conflict of interest works. So that's what happens with these sort of connections, where you are always thinking about it in the back of your head, and it informs your behavior, right? I mean, one of the things with C-18 as laid out, right? the Facebook, let's use Facebook as an example, has to come to an agreement with, call it the National Post, right? And as part of that agreement, they have to assure that the money they are sending them is spent on national, Canadian news, right? And then after that, the CRTC has to approve that agreement, right? So just like you said, when you're building that agreement about how that money gets spent, you're going to build it knowing that you are seeking the CRTC's approval, right? So you essentially, through this system, whether intended or otherwise, you have the behaviors of the newsrooms of the nation being, they are being overseen by an arm of government. And I just find that no matter how benign the intentions, I just find that terrifying.
Well, that's it. And I mean, any developed democracy always will have a clause somewhere in their constitution or their charter or whatever, making sure to protect free press. I mean, they recognize how important it is to have media feel comfortable with the ability to be critical of their own government. If you lose that, you can be into a great deal of trouble. And of course, whether well-meaning or not, authoritarian regimes do not like a free press. So thus, that's one of the first things they'll always control.
Yeah, and when we get into this, we're talking about sort of misuse of language, right? This is a free and independent media. Everybody says that, right? Our media are free and independent. Russia TV, was in the news recently, RTV, right? I mean, the Russians claim it's a free and independent media. One of the things we have to be careful about when we do these things is, well, we may assume that we have the high moral ground on things, and that we do, is that we are not using the exact same arguments as other nations who are less democratically inclined than, say, we are, and think it's okay because we're better. The argument is either good or the argument is bad. So you either have an independent press or you don't. Just because you're getting your money from a Justin Trudeau government as opposed to a Vladimir Putin government doesn't mean you're not taking the government's money.
Well, that's it. And we're in a period of great flux. And I mean, I understand people are also mistrustful of some of these social media giants. I mean, they exert a great amount of influence on the information that's going out and our abilities. Facebook frustrates us to no end with the Western Standard because they're very essential to us to be able to share our stories to a broad audience. But at the same time, it's a symbiotic relationship. I mean, we're providing content for them. It's good for them. And they provide a platform for us to share it out. But we can be pushed around a bit by some of those bigger ones as well. But I mean, letting those relationships evolve on their own should be able to let the chips fall the right way. We don't need the government in there stirring it up in the meantime.
Yeah, but I mean, you raise a good point there, and you raise one in which I think there's a legitimate case for some oversight, not by the government itself, but from an arm's length agency. And like I'm a senior fellow with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and my former chairman at the CRTC, Conrad von Finkenstein, is a senior fellow at the C.D. Howe Institute. And we actually created a policy paper that said, okay, if you're going to do this stuff, this is how you should do it. And we called it the Social Media Responsibility Act. And the idea behind that is to make sure that companies like Facebook, who are, let's face it, are in a pretty dominant position in the marketplace, right? It's not a full monopoly, but it's as close as you're going to get, right? If you want to reach audiences, you don't have too many options other than to go through Facebook. It's to make sure that they're behaving themselves and they're treating everybody equally and fairly, and they're upholding free speech. That's a different approach than the one that Canadian Department of Heritage has been taking, which is much more hands-on. We want to make... Our suggestion is that if you're going to regulate the internet, you make sure that you regulate not the internet, but these large dominant companies, to make sure that they are treating people fairly and giving everyone an equal voice. So if you get booted off for saying something bad, somebody on the other end of the spectrum gets booted off for saying the same thing that's bad. You have the same rules and the same application of the rules.
Yeah, which is always difficult to come up with, but not impossible. Media, though, is in a general period of flux. We're in a transition right now that we've never seen before. The conventional outlets are having a very hard time. There's no denying that. I mean, I've talked about that before. The advantages we've set up, at some degree of expense, a studio and a broadcast and a publication now and everything, which took some investment. But I mean, not even a tiny fraction of what it would have cost 20 years ago if you wanted to open a television studio or a printing press or things like that. So, I mean, the older institutions and the mainstream media outlets that still have those large infrastructure and overhead, they are having a really hard time competing with outlets like ours right now. And again, I mean, I'm a free market guy. I just kind of say let the chips fall where they may, but it still is putting a lot of pressure on the entire industry right now. How can we work with that transition, perhaps?
Oh yeah, I mean we're going through a transition right now that's every bit as profound as the invention of the printing press, right? I mean, people need to get their heads around that. There's a lot of people in the traditional fields who are kind of like, well, this is like the new, internet. This is like the new cable, or is this what this? No, this is something entirely new, right? And it's had a devastating effect on the old newspaper industry and that sort of stuff. So if governments are looking to support, if people are worried about the state of journalism, which is a legitimate worry, I mean, you can worry about it for all kinds of reasons, but if you're worried about it, it having a financial foundation, what you should be investing in, or what you should be getting out of the way of, and this is, I'm a bit more like you in this, is where can government get out of the way, right? And allow for innovation to flourish, right? So like your media, and there's some others around, it'll work or it won't. Nobody knows yet, but you probably are adjusting things all the time on the way you go. But you are innovating. You are being entrepreneurial. And that's what you need to do. What the government's doing right now with C-18 is it is propping up clearly failed business models. What it should be doing, if it does anything, is getting out of the way of innovation for innovators such as yourself, and also seeing if helping these guys transition into whatever it is that's going to work for the next stage. But all that big old infrastructure, all those expensive collective bargaining agreements, they're not sustainable.
No, we just have to accept that it's going to change, and some people have to flex. And there's still room for some great media professionals. I mean, it's worked in our benefit in some ways. We've gotten a hold of Dave Naylor here in our newsroom, and we have columnists, people you've worked with, familiar with, such as Makachuk and others. And they've moved on to the new format right now, though it's still difficult because, I mean, it's not as lucrative as it used to be. I mean, one of the things people forget is classified ads that you would know as well as anybody. That was a huge part of the revenue stream for newspapers, and they're gone now, and they got to figure out how to cope with that.
Oh, and they've been gone for a long time. Classified basically paid for the newsroom, right? In terms of profit, and maybe even more than that, right? So losing that, and that's like a remarkable, right? Because it's initially you were losing it to other online, revenue or companies and that sort of stuff who were still charging. And then Kijiji came along and has given it away for free. How do you compete against that? Here you've got something that, job ads, the employment section, that sort of stuff. Those are all new things. Attaching a subscription to things and proving your value to readers is really important. It seems to be working. You guys do it. Nobby's putting the old band back together, all that sort of stuff, right? So, yeah, I mean, keep innovating. That's what new companies should be doing. One of the things that concerns me about C-18 is that by propping up the failed business models, they're actually handicapping entrepreneurs like you.
Yeah, well, and slowing that evolution. I mean, to a degree, you could think it's doing a disservice to some of the established journalists who, unfortunately might have to move on from those legacy outlets, but they delay it too long. I mean, it's a boat that's sailing. I used the analogy the other day. I mean, I started in the conventional survey industry. I had to learn optical survey and all of that. And then GPS came along and wiped out all my training. A guy could learn in 20 minutes, with a digital unit, what took me years of getting abused by a surveyor to figure out how to do with a transit. But your options as a surveyor were to embrace GPS and move on to the new technology, or be left behind. And if somebody had artificially held up the old survey sort, some guys would have stuck with it, but they would have paid a bad price for it in the long run.
Absolutely. I mean, you've got to be able to change, and it's very. I remember when I was in the newspaper business, somebody used to say, the moment you see a trend arrive on the pages of a newspaper, you know it's over. Which was like, they were big, like oil tanker type, very vehicles. They're very powerful, very strong, very rich at their time, but they were pretty hard to turn around in a hurry in terms of that. So, I mean, the dinosaur analogy isn't fair, but well, in a sense, it is. I mean, it wasn't the dinosaur's fault that the asteroid hit, right? And the internet is the asteroid that hit the newspaper industry. There's no doubt about that. I think there's always going to be a market for good, fair, unbiased news. I think people really need to get back to their basics and become reporters. There's way too much journalism going on, activism blended and that sort of stuff. People always just wanted, tell me what happened and let me make up my own mind, right? That's always what worked. There's no reason why it can't work again. And if people get back to that straight news, let it go. There's a lot of young people running around Parliament Hill right now. That's their first job. I'm not sure if they can, I don't want to insult some of them, but certainly all of them, but there's some of them that I'm not sure you could trust to cover a motel fire. It's a craft. You need to get good at it. It's not, you're not on a mission to do anything other than gather the facts and present them in a fair and unbiased fashion to your audience. I think that's the prayer people should hold to.
Yeah, well, and those principles can be reestablished with new outlets and new outfits. Like here, I won't write a paragraph of news copy. I'm not appropriate for it or capable of it. I'm an opinion guy. And likewise, as you said, Nobby keeps a high standard and makes sure that all of our reporters are sticking to journalistic standards. And, if we can do that, other outlets can. And that's part of what's been our success so far.
Yeah. And I mean, all of this funding going to what we call legacy media and the big companies, Bell and Shaw and Rogers. And I mean, Bill C-18, the biggest beneficiary of that is going to be the CBC, which isn't an extremist at all.
Oh.
How does that work? I mean, you're creating a fund to help people who are, whose businesses are dying, and the CBC comes along, all of a sudden just bellies up to the bar and says, make that around for me as well, right? Away you go. But there might be some advantage to entrepreneurs like Western Standard now to be able to label yourself as, we don't take the money. Yeah. We are unapproved. We don't count. The only approval we want is from readers. We don't care about the government's approval. You'll do so at some expense to yourself, but that's short term, and long term, it might actually really work for you.
Yeah, well, I like to think it's going to benefit us much more than any expense. Yeah, the short term pain. So, in kind of closing up, though, we've got all these bills. They're pending right now. As you said, it's a multi-front thing. We got C11, we got C18. With the Liberal NDP coalition, it's pretty likely they're going to pass without issue. How can we fight back against this?
Well, I think there's still some opportunities left in the committee process, right? There's when you get into that, it's not like question period where politicians have to perform theatrics. And I have seen in the past, once they get into the committee process and people start proposing amendments, that there are points at which somebody might say, you kind of got a point there, right? We can reword this to this and that. So the legislation will pass, maybe with some impact, but I mean, people should do their best to follow this, make noise with their MPs and make noise with Heritage Canada and other places, and even with their local media, who are benefiting from this, and ask for more information. It's been kind of frustrating for somebody like me I realize I'm really close to it, and there's some sort of risk of me coming across as too policy wonky. But like, if people can get that upset about wearing a mask, how can you not get upset about losing your freedom of speech? How can you not get upset about your media, right? Taking money from the government, being dependent on the government, right? Like, I'm not saying being upset about a mask doesn't have value or isn't purposeless, but it's temporary, right? This other stuff is going to last for a very long time and will have a creep to it that is worrisome.
Well, yeah, it's always a lot harder to get rights back than it is to give them away.
Oh yeah, once they're out the door, they're gone.
Well, we'll see how it all develops. It's troublesome, but I mean, I'm looking still to the future with a lot of optimism. I mean, we're doing well. We'll keep pushing through no matter what, as will a number of other outlets and people with, an integrity and ambition. But it just might be some bumps in the road along the way. So I appreciate you.
Keep your head up, because C11 applies to all online audio and video.
Oh, I know. I'm watching it
closely. That's what we just did.
and I'm not always one who's unafraid to ruffle some feathers with stuff I do. And there's that risk. I could tick off the wrong person, and something gets interpreted through that, and suddenly they pull the plug on our broadcast. I do worry about that, but I can't let that change how I'll approach things, or there just won't be much point to the show anymore.
That's right.
I really, as I said, appreciate your voice. How can people find out more information? You're with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute as well. I mean, when I was trying to look up the one-line description of what you're up to these days, it was just so long, but you're a busy man.
Oh, yeah, on there. I usually just go with former newspaper executive and past CRTC vice chair. That tightens it up a little bit. I would encourage people to, go online and go to places like michaelgeist.ca. Michael's a law professor at the University of Ottawa and the Canada Research Chair in Internet Law. And he is a very articulate critic of this, and he manages to analyze it legally, but still make his analyses accessible to those of us among the great unwashed when it comes to that sort of stuff. So Michael's actually very good at translating things like that. I expect there will be some reporting in platforms such as your own, independent platforms. Blacklock's Reporter is another one. I think The Line is another group that's not taking the money. So find the truly independent media and look for commentary and stories on those posts, because I'm afraid we can't expect right now within our major media to see much pushback on any of these bills.
No, unfortunately. And as you said, that's that consequence perhaps of making them a bit dependent on that in the first place, which is sad to see.
It is. And it's sad to see that they're actually so desperate that this is happening too. Nobody wants to see that happen. Nobody likes to see people get laid off. Nobody likes to see companies fail.
No, and that's why I hope, and I like talking about a transition rather than the dynamiting of an old institution. And I do I get on the case of establishment media a lot, but I do like to put out the caveat now and then. There's still some very fantastic skilled journalists out there in those legacy outlets, including even the CBC. I just wish they would move on to private ventures.
Yeah, no, I agree. There's some really, really good journalists, and like the old phrase used to be, newspapers don't report when airplanes land safely. So people don't react when they see good journalism as much as they react when they see bad journalism, right? So it makes me angry, I guess. It makes me frustrated, or I'm disappointed is probably a better way to say it, when I see bad journalism, because it drags down the good ones. And there are a lot of good ones. And as you said, including at the CBC. So we need to make sure they make it through this.
Absolutely. Well, again, I really appreciate you joining us today. I hope we get the chance to talk again soon. Maybe we'll have a positive development in media to discuss at that time.
No, we'll continue to make sure this works.
Right on. Thanks, Peter.
Thanks very much.
So as I said, that was Peter Menzies, as he said, a former newspaper executive. He's with the CRTC. He's a fellow with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute and a great number of things. And he's active on Twitter and social media in general, and can really speak with experience and authority on these media issues. I mean, it sounds a little self-serving when we're on here discussing those things sometimes, but, well, I guess it is. But it's to everybody's benefit to have a free press. As I've talked about before in the past, I've had some, good experiences. I did have a good young life, and I did have the opportunity to travel the Soviet Union while it was still the Soviet Union, and to see the true extreme of where propaganda and information control can get to. And it's possible, and it does happen. We don't want to go back there. It is a terrible area to go. So looking at some of this other stuff, and we're going to talk to Franco pretty quickly. I'm going to speak actually to one more of our sponsors, since we're talking about paying our bills and being the good capitalists that we are, and people who support freedoms, and that's the Canadian Shooting Sports Association. These guys have been a sponsor for us for quite some time as well, and they're a very good one. Their name says what they are. They're an association for people who enjoy firearms for whatever reason they may want to. Where you're a collector, you're a target shooter, a trap shooter like that picture there, or a hunter. It's up to you. As long as you're obeying the law, it's none of the government's business what you're doing. And these guys offer everything from, links to videos on safe firearm use and stuff like that, or networking with other firearm owners. That's what an association's all about. Most importantly of all, they're pushing back against the government's legislation that's trying to take away your right and ability to own and enjoy these firearms. Because as we've seen with the Liberals, they keep recategorizing firearms, turning law-abiding people into criminals. Hunting rifles are suddenly assault-style rifles, and now they're going to take them away. Well, you got to push back, guys. If you don't push back, they will get away with it. And these guys have a number of legal challenges out on behalf of firearm owners. They are taking the government to court. They're pushing back on this. And if we don't push back, it's kind of like when I was talking to our previous guest, Peter Menzies, you lose those rights, they're a lot harder to get back. So get on there. Canadian Shooting Sports Association, their website, cssa-cila.org, or just Google them and join them. Take out a membership. That's how they can keep standing up for you, because it's very, very important. All right, so we're going to get on some more budget talk with Mr. Terrazzano pretty soon here. Let me just look a little more through the news scroll. Here's an interesting one. It's, it's mixed with me. You see, you want to... you always want someone else to be the one that gets taxed. That's the thing. It's always easy to say, tax that guy, but not me. Tax this person, but not me. But a lot of people don't look at the progression on how that all works. And I see that the government went out, though, and they're putting, it looks like over $1 billion new taxes against banks and insurers. And, I despise dealing with banks. I despise dealing with insurance companies, because there are two areas of business where you can't avoid them. You have to deal with them. And you go in and you always feel like a supplicant. You don't feel like a customer. You feel like you're always going to ask if they could do this for you. Could you please finance this for me? Could you please lend me money for that? Could you please cover my vehicle or cover my house? And it seems on a whim they could always decline you. So it makes it kind of hard to like those guys. But they are a part of life, and we can't avoid them. And now with these new taxes coming on the banks and insurers, as much as people feel, that's a good finger in the eye to them, guys, it still comes back to you. It always comes back to you. The bank is just going to raise your rates. The insurance companies are just going to raise your rates. The government is just finding other ways to suck money out of your pocket. It's just a more indirect route. So don't celebrate higher taxes on institutions, even if they're institutions you don't like. And like I said, I don't like banks and insurance companies, but I also understand that the government taxes them. I'm still going to end up the one who's on the hook for that in the long run. They're just going to raise my insurance rates. They're just going to raise my banking rates. We've got to push the government to cut their bloody spending, not just try and put him, say, tax that person over there instead, or get more money out of this over there. It's not the way to do it. It's not going to work. You always pay for it. And if enough Canadians could ever understand that, maybe we'd start electing better governments, though we've got a little ways to go yet. So what's this? It's just a quote to finish up with that from the Prime Minister, saying when he made his promises, everyone else had to tighten their belt. Well, actually, the Prime Minister never did, so he can't speak to that firsthand. And he says, we're going to ask them to do a little bit more. It's always a little bit more. I love it when people ask for spending or talk about increases. It's just a cup of coffee a day. It adds up, guys, and I can only drink so much coffee. But either way, he points out that banks and insurers have been doing very well. Well, so what? Like they speak of that as if it's a problem. It's good for businesses to do well, even if they're businesses you don't like. The main thing is keep them competitive, so I can move from bank to bank or insurance company to insurance company, and then I'll probably still get the best deal out of them that I can, even if I hate dealing with them. But man, when the government starts getting in on it, we're all going to lose, and we do every time. Okay, I've bitched, cursed, whined, and ranted enough. Let's bring somebody else in to take that over for a bit. We've got Franco Terrazzano from the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, because this is Super Bowl day for Franco, or yesterday was. It's the annual federal budget, and I'm certain he's got a lot to tell us about it. Hey, Franco, how's it going?
Cory, I'm doing well, man. How are you doing?
Pretty good, actually. Getting ready for the weekend.
Good stuff. Love the rant on the bank tax. I think you absolutely nailed it, right? It's really going to fall on Canadians when we go to the banks. Well, higher fees. Surprise, surprise. But it's not only that, Cory. Yesterday, we saw the government going after banks and insurance companies. Well, what business, what sector, what industry, what type of Canadian are they going to go after next with higher taxes, right? These taxes on certain businesses, these taxes on the so-called wealthy, they're the Trojan horse of politics. They get the tax through the door and then they expand it, and eventually they tax more and more Canadians. And here's just one other point. I've heard some people say, well, how are you going to pay down the $1 trillion debt? Well, when it comes to deficit reduction, this is little more than silly political posturing. Cory, the way the Trudeau government is spending money left, right, and center, the government would blow through that type of cash in a day. And one last thing to end my rant. You know, Trudeau talks about the banks and these businesses doing well. You know who's been doing really well during the pandemic? Mr. Trudeau himself, who's pocketed not one, not two, but 3 pay raises during the pandemic.
Yeah, most of us haven't been enjoying such as, speaking his language. I mean, to throw his own words back when he was talking about that, he said, big banks got a windfall. Well, what the hell did you get, Justin? If the rest of us aren't getting raises. Yeah,
no kidding. If you total up the 3 pandemic pay raises that MPs, our members of parliament, gave to themselves, they range all the way from an extra $10,000 in total for your backbencher, all the way up to more than $20,000 for Trudeau compared to his pre-pandemic salary.
Oh, good work if you can get it. It's something else. So where else to go with this budget? Maybe you got a Coles Notes version to give us here to start things off.
Oh, I absolutely do. So budget 2022. It's another credit card budget from Canada's national credit card government. We're seeing a huge deficit, $52.8 billion, which follows the last 2 years of astronomical deficits of $300 billion plus in 2020, $100 billion plus last year. So another big deficit. What's so frustrating, though, Cory, is that this government has absolutely zero plan on when it's going to balance the budget. The best that this government can give taxpayers is, hey, in 2026, we'll finally bring the deficit down to single-digit billions. That's the best they want to give us. And Cory, I don't even know if we can trust them to meet that target. Remember back in the day, Prime Minister Trudeau said he would balance the budget in 2019, but then he missed that target by $20 billion.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm glad you pointed out, because you can't use that excuse forever. The difference between the pre-pandemic spending budget and our current one. So, I mean, there were some exceptional circumstances in the last couple of years, but that excuse has to go by the wayside. We've got to try and look back to what our normal bar of spending was, and they didn't stay anywhere close to within it.
And Cory, then if you want to call it normal, if we can call it normal, it really wasn't normal. Remember, pre-pandemic, the federal government was spending all-time highs. So in 2018, you had Trudeau spending more than the federal government did during any single year during World War II. And yes, that's even after accounting for inflation and population growth. Now, this year, Trudeau wants to spend about $452 billion. Cory, that's $90 billion more than pre-pandemic. That's $90 billion more than what the government was spending when it was spending all-time highs. So this is another very costly budget. Of course, the pain is being felt today through inflation, and it's going to be felt tomorrow through higher taxes.
Well, so some of the spending initiatives, I mean, they really had a housing focus. It was housing. I see billions of dollars committed over the next 5 or 6 years towards affordable housing. But does it look like this will be effective whatsoever? I started my rant off with it. People who were listening all the way through, no, I don't believe that. But what's the taxpayers' interpretation, Federation?
Yeah, the government wants to tackle affordability with more debt, but trying to fight inflation with more government debt is like trying to put out the fire with a can of gasoline. It's just going to make things worse. Look, this government tries to talk about affordability, and it should care about affordability because Canadians are struggling. Many Canadians can't afford to fuel the car up with gasoline or to put ground beef in their grocery cart. And that's because you have this government that's been spending like crazy for years and raising taxes. But the answer to this inflation problem is not more spending. It's less spending. It's less government deficits, and it's less tax hikes. So we're seeing the government pull us in the wrong direction. We're seeing the government double down on what is really driving this inflation.
So let's get to some of the positive areas. I guess not positive in reality, but what would we like to see? How could the budget be balanced? And of course, there's the thing with the people who are fearful and dependent on government largesse all the time. What would be cut?
Cory, the government could balance its budget within a few years by 2024 just by bringing spending back to pre-pandemic levels, which were already all-time highs. That's how the government could balance the budget. And with overspending that we've seen from this Trudeau government for years and years and years, finding savings in every single area of the budget should be like finding water in the ocean, right? So we should be seeing across the board savings. But let's even set those aside for now. Here's a few other ones. Of course, leadership has to start at the top. MPs got to stop giving themselves pay raises while the people that they're supposed to represent continue to struggle with revolving government lockdowns, restrictions, higher taxes, you name it. But also, you can't keep giving bureaucrats bigger pay raises. 312,000 federal government bureaucrats got a pay raise during the pandemic. Let's look at equalization. This is a slush fund for some provincial premiers. It continues to go up by $1 billion every single year. Well, of course, the Canadian Taxpayers Federation presented to the Finance Committee a way to phase out equalization in a fair manner over 20 years. Something like that needs to happen. And Cory, just before our segment, I heard you talking about the gun grab and buyback. Now, this is going to be a taxpayer boondoggle. It has every makings of one. This is likely going to cost billions of dollars, but it won't even make Canada safe. And that's because it's going after law-abiding citizens. Cory, I don't know about you, but I can't imagine too many gang members showing up at government offices handing in their guns. No, this is targeting Canadian citizens, law-abiding citizens. It's really not going to do much to address the real threat, which is criminal activity and the illegal flow of guns across the border.
Yeah, and I mean, it's like the Liberals can't learn from their own actions. I mean, it was kind of before your time there, but with Alan Rock and the big gun registry of the 90s, and they assured us this is going to cost 20, 30, 40 million dollars. It ended up costing, I believe, $2 billion by the time they scrapped it. And again, it wasn't effective. It didn't reduce crime. It didn't take illegal guns off the street. They're just doing the same thing from a different angle, and it'll be just as effective and just as expensive, I'm afraid.
And Cory, let me talk about two big spending items that really caught my eye in the budget. So even just setting aside all the spending reductions I just named. Number one, $15 billion on what they're calling some type of growth fund. Now, the details aren't really in the budget, but essentially what it smells like is just some corporate welfare slush fund to the tune of $15 billion. But look, this government could even balance the budget of a lemonade stand. I don't trust it to be running around playing investment banker with $15 billion worth of taxpayers' money. If they want to grow the economy, cut out the middleman, just keep that $15 billion in taxpayers' pockets, in families' pockets, in businesses' budgets, and let businesses and families do the rest. The next thing that caught my eye, Cory, is $1 billion to create some type of government agency to be promoting investment and innovation. But Cory, I don't know about you, but doesn't that sound like a bit of an oxymoron? Government agency on innovation?
Yeah, no, that's never been an area of skill. And no government's immune from that. I mean, in Alberta, well, look at our investment in the Keystone. That didn't pay off well. Or going farther back, we went into MagCan, we went into Gainers, we went into Novotel, all these things. If people don't remember, but the Alberta government got into business all over the place, and all of them failed. All of them. Their record was abysmal, and this was a ostensibly conservative government. Now we got the Liberals running around picking winners and losers. I think the only winners are going to be, of course, those guys who accept the subsidies, and the losers will be Canadians as usual. And
the bond fund managers. Don't forget about the bond fund managers, because of all the interest charges that taxpayers have to pay. Look, it's a crazy amount of money that is being wasted on interest charges on the government credit card. Every single month, taxpayers have to pay more than $2 billion just on interest charges on the government's credit card. Now, to put that in perspective, that means taxpayers are paying more this year on federal debt interest charges than the Alberta government will spend on healthcare.
Yeah, and that's just money essentially flushed down the toilet, and they're borrowing more. So not only will they add to what we have to pay interest on, but the Bank of Canada has already been signaling they're going to be raising those interest rates in the years to come too.
I know it seems like a lot of pain for Canadians, and the reason is because you have this government that put itself between a rock and a hard place. Years of easy money policy, massive printing of money on display during the pandemic, and of course, overspending for years from the federal government. So, look, there's just no way to skip out on paying the piper. Eventually, you have to pay the piper. And if you don't believe so, well, then just ask the finance ministers from the 1990s what happens when politicians kick the deficit can down the road for far too long. Remember in the 90s, Cory, you'll remember this, maybe I won't, but you had these finance ministers from all levels of government, from different political parties, who had to make some very, very, very tough decisions. And what we continue to say now is either this government makes some tough decisions, like bringing spending back to pre-pandemic levels, which were already all-time highs, or tougher decisions are going to be forced on us, just like what happened in Saskatchewan when you had an NDP government that was forced to close more than 50 hospitals across that prairie province.
Well, that's it. I mean, fiscal reality does come home to roost. There's a lot of parts of the 90s I don't remember really well, but I indulged a lot in those days. But I do remember the politics a lot of the time. And yeah, politicians of every stripe had to do it. The Romano NDP government had to balance their budget. Jean Chrétien, a Liberal government, had to balance their budget. And this will eventually come to us. And I mean, it doesn't matter how much the unions scream and how much the left screams, because that's what happens when the cuts come. When the cupboard truly becomes bare, it doesn't matter if it's an NDP government, a Liberal government, they have to cut. And if we'd cut modestly now, it'll save from the drastic cuts later, but not enough people seem to realize that yet.
And I also want to just make it clear, this isn't just consequences for years down the road, right? A lot of people, when they think about government debt, they think of, yeah, there's money being wasted on interest payments and it's too much money. We need that to be going and used to build more hospitals, roads, lower taxes, things of that nature. But we're also seeing real life consequences today. The inflation tax is showing Canadians firsthand that you can't just have government debt running wild. You can't have the government's printing press on overdrive and think that nothing's going to happen. During the pandemic, we saw the federal government central bank, the Bank of Canada, print $370 billion right out of thin air, buying financial assets like Government of Canada debt. And the problem there is the more dollars that this Bank of Canada prints, the less that your dollars in your bank account or in your savings account will buy. So it sure has seemed that Ottawa has been financing a good chunk of its deficits with the printing press, which means that Ottawa has been financing and getting some of its money by devaluing your money. That's the inflation tax, and the debt is having a real world consequence by driving up the cost of living here in Canada.
Yeah, and it's just brutal on people with fixed incomes and such. I mean, you can't flex and move to go with that. I mean, some people can float a bit with inflation. Their salaries will increase a bit, but not everybody's in that position, and it's going to be very harmful. There was also some payroll taxes that rose.
Yep, payroll taxes are up again in 2022. Expect to pay about $400 extra if you're making about $65,000 or more just through payroll taxes. So what really caught the eye in the budget, I think, of the media is the bank and insurance tax. But we also have to remember that taxes are going up this year, even outside of what was really in that budget. And I'm talking about the carbon tax, right? That just went up April 1. Alcohol taxes just went up April 1, and payroll taxes are also going up in 2022.
So was there a couple of taxes they reduced somewhere, just to throw a little credit where due?
Well, yeah, there was, I guess, two types of tax reductions. There was a tax on low alcoholic beer, an excise tax on that, and there should have never been an excise tax on lower non-alcoholic beverages, right? So it's good to see the government scrap that. That's good policy. Credit where credit's due. And there was some other tax relief for small businesses. I mean, everyone knows that small businesses need tax relief, especially right now after the last 2 years that governments have put them through. And the government is allowing more businesses, so medium-sized businesses, to be eligible for the small business tax rate, which is lower than the general business tax rate. So those are both, good moves for sure, but not even close to what we need to be seeing from this government on tax relief.
Yeah, no, they are drops in the bucket, and but I guess it's worth mentioning. We're here to cover kind of the whole budget. I mean, one that gets me is any kind of increase to payroll taxes. I mean, government talks about taxes as being something to stop the activity of something. Well, when you're going to tax people on their employment, you're going to reduce their employment. They don't seem to understand that when it comes.
Yeah, and that's money that they should be leaving in Canadians' pockets. Families are having such a difficult time. Canadians are having such a difficult time, but also that impacts businesses as well. And obviously, businesses need liquidity. They need to have money to reinvest in their operations, get more people back to work. So it should be a no-brainer that right now is the worst possible time to raise taxes. So very unfortunate that Ottawa continues to raise taxes. And Cory, I think it's important to talk about international comparisons here, because we're seeing other countries do the exact opposite. We saw South Korea reduce gas taxes by 20%. We saw both France and Spain reduce electricity taxes. Italy reducing taxes as well. You have India that cut fuel taxes. Poland cut fuel taxes. Sri Lanka cutting taxes. The United Kingdom just announced fuel tax relief. Cory, you even have President Joe Biden down south saying that he is considering big-time gas tax relief. So you have these other countries that are reducing taxes while Ottawa continues to make our lives harder with higher tax bills.
Yeah, we're certainly not going to remain competitive for much longer at that rate. Well, thanks for the update today, Franco. I knew it wasn't going to be all sunshine and lollipops, but we need that, realistic breakdown of what we're facing year by year on these things, and hopefully enough people will eventually turn that tide at some point. So where can we find more information on what you do and where people can push back a bit against this ever-increasing tax burden?
Head over to taxpayer.com. Check out our newsroom. Check out the petitions on there. Follow us on Facebook. Just type in Canadian Taxpayers Federation, and you can follow us on Twitter as well. And Cory, thank you so much for having me on today.
Oh, never a problem. Always good to have you on, Franco. So I'm sure we'll talk again sometime soon, and I'll let you get back to what I'm sure is the busiest week of the year for you.
Okay, take care, Cory. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. So yes, that was Franco Terrazzano of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Some people say, why do I get those CTF guys on all the time? Well, for one, because I like them. But the other part is they're one of the few guests who they never asking for more money. Everybody else say, I want, they talk about a pet program or this or that. But they feel that there should be more money going towards it from here, there, or wherever. The Taxpayers Federation is actually constantly saying, no, we want to let you have a little more of your own money. So it's a refreshing change, and I like to bring them on. They stand up and dig into those dry issues. I mean, that budget was 304 pages, I think, if I recall. I did actually read and skim it. And somebody's got to have the job of going through all those things and finding out what they're really burying in there, what they're really hiding in there. And the Taxpayers Federation does that on our behalf. I mean, it's their job, but at least they can summarize it and encapsulate it so we can digest it and see what they're doing. Speaking of inflation and things such as that, let's get on to, I see some discussion, and I know not everybody agrees on Bitcoin, and I see from Marvin Sherry Stewart there, so, back and forth on digital currencies. Look, digital currencies are voluntary. You don't have to get into them. I like them. I think they're a wave of the future. I think they're a beneficial thing. I do worry about the government getting into a cashless world, but you know what? We're already there. I mean, how many people carry cash and do anything anymore? All your money is in conventional banks right now. It comes off your credit card, your debit card. And we saw just recently that the government will get at that money. They will take it. They will seize it, and the banks will be complicit with it. They've done it. It's not conspiracy theory anymore. It's not paranoia. It's been done right in this country only a couple months ago. One thing the government didn't get a bit of, no Bitcoin. They didn't get a penny of it because they can't. Bitcoin, well, this is our sponsor, and they show you how that can work, how you can put your money into a wallet, a ledger that is completely separate and apart from the banks. They don't share that with the banks. They don't share that with the government. It's yours. What Bitcoin well does, they didn't ever even have access to your money. They just guide you through the process. And we do it here at the Western Standard. I got involved, an old Luddite like me, by just having a monthly program we have here at the Western Standard. A percentage of my paycheck goes into a Bitcoin wallet. The Western Standard actually matches that. So every month, a little bit more gets set aside. And now that it's set up, if I should choose to, if I ever have any extra money at the end of the month, that's not kind of a rare thing, but I could put a little more into the Bitcoin account if I wanted. And that's something that, isn't based on Canadian inflation rates and things like that. It's a whole different currency for you. So, I mean, you can look at that as a hedge. And I mean, there's other digital currencies out there besides Bitcoin as well. But Bitcoin, well, of course, they specialize in Bitcoin as per their name. And they are fantastic for, leading you through the process, showing you how to do it. And you don't have to go in with a giant big investment. It's not a big thing like that. And as we can see, you can pay your bills and your credit cards with it. They make it practical, right? It's not just something you're setting aside. I mean, hey, there's some benefit to say talking about grabbing some gold and sticking it under the bed for when the apocalypse comes. But you can't pay your electric bill that month with it. Well, with Bitcoin, actually, you can. So you can actually utilize this currency practically while you're at it too, if you want to. And also a lot of people use it as a longer term investment. Either way, check out bitcoinwell.com. These guys will help you take control of your money. And again, it's a Western Canadian company. I love pushing those. So let's look at some of this other stuff from the government. The cabinet's going to extend for years the payment of $5,000 rebates to electric car buyers. Again, the government punishing you, trying to direct you. You know what term we used to hear a lot of before is social engineering. People talk now with how governments do the social credit system to try and push people into doing different things and things like that. Brad asking, by the way, do I use Bitcoin well? I just said it. Yes, I do. So either way, this way they just keep trying to force us into electric cars. We don't want to. They're expensive. They're inefficient. They suck in the cold. They got a crappy range. My house isn't built to charge them, and electricity isn't free. My electric bill the other month was horrible. At least Jane told me. I don't take care of all that stuff. I'm lucky I have a wife who deals with all that on my behalf, but she does remind me how much it costs, as I'm leaving the lights on around the house and charging up stuff that doesn't need to be charged. Either way, the Privy Council office showed that Canadians consider electric cars too expensive for everyday drivers. Yes, they still do, and it's because they suck. Giving me another $5,000 to pay it doesn't make me any more inclined to get there. But what it will do is, of course, force all of us to pay the people who choose to take those vehicles out. And with the only people who are using them still, despite a decade of always saying we're all going to switch to it, look around. They're urban dwelling virtue signalers with big budgets. You want to be able to drive around in your Tesla and show off that you have an electric vehicle. And hey, if that's what you like, you know what? Good for you. As long as it's your money. I shouldn't have to subsidize your purchase of a luxury electric vehicle. Do it on your own. Living in rural areas, nobody's buying those things. You can't rely on that. Either way, they might get there one day. They might. I mean, they're developing. They're better now than they were 10 years ago, but they're still not practical. Like Jade, the commenter, is pointing out, yeah, how are people living in apartments going to charge their cars? You get in trouble in the city as it is, just running an electric cord across to plug in your block heater in wintertime. You can get a ticket for that. Or people steal it, or it gets chopped up when people run a snowblower over it. Electric cars are not for everybody. They're not that practical, but the government will not give up on trying to force us into these bloody things. And it's costly. So they're extending that plan now till 2025 at a cost of $1.7 billion. And getting back to what I was talking about before, it's not costing somebody else that much money. It's costing us. We all get to pay for it. And it's insane. Insane. The finance department says 136,000 buyers received rebates for that. Yeah, but when you think out of a country of nearly 40 million people, of whom at least half are drivers, this is a tiny minority that we're all subsidizing, guys. Shouldn't be subsidizing anybody. If you want it, buy your own. Don't put it on me. But again, the government is trying to push us where we don't want to go. And it's a very bad trend, and it's taking us bad places. Going further, I mean, on to some of that discussion, when we've got a real problem with ideology, and things that bother me a lot actually are the politics of envy, and we get a lot of confusion with things. When people talk about, say, raising corporate taxes, that's one of the siren calls of the NDP, and others too, when they talk about tax the rich. Well, a few things, and people throw the numbers out. They show if we raise taxes on like every billionaire in Canada by a certain chunk, the government would still burn through that money within a couple of days. All it does is beat down the larger industrialists who still brought a lot of business and revenue into the country, and doesn't really help the bottom line of the budget. When the government wants to pay the bills, they hit the middle class every time. They have to. It's just math. And then when people say, well, raise corporate taxes, well, that still costs you. People don't follow the chain of money enough quite often. And corporate taxes, corporations, think about what they are. You know, a lot of people envision some Scrooge McDuck swimming through a money bin full of dollars and coins and cents, and it's just all liquid cash that they can get into. The reality is they're owned by shareholders, millions and millions. And who are those? They're you. Even if you don't have a formal stock portfolio, what do you think your pension plan is? I mean, they don't just set that money aside and stick it somewhere. The only reason it grows and that it floats a bit with inflation, whether it's a private pension plan or even the federal plan, or if we get to the point, if we ever get the Alberta pension plan, which I hope we do, it's going to be invested in a bunch of stocks. You will be a stockholder. And if you tax those corporations more, you're just taxing yourself. Those corporate profits go down, the growth of your pension plan goes down. Banks make their money out of a lot of those investments. Insurance companies, getting back to those companies I don't like. And if they aren't making their money out of those, they will raise those direct fees upon you. You can't win. I know it sounds like it. The bottom line is we need smaller government. And just simply punishing and taxing the fat cats as we see them, we don't realize that we're a part of those fat cats. We're integrated with them. We're tied into them. And the other thing is, of course, it's an international market. It's a world market. And this is something the left just refuses to realize and figure out. So when they raise corporate taxes, business activity goes down. Investment goes down. You can't draw new money in for new ventures and projects. And the ones that are existing, of course, don't have as much profit. Thus, they don't invest more in expansion, in innovation, in hiring more people. Like, we got to understand that chain of money and how it works. There's no simple answers. And that simplistic call of tax the rich or tax the corporations doesn't work, guys, even if it sounds good. You know, that's something that statement is a lot that comes from the Taxpayers Federation, came from the provincial government in the past. Remember Ralph Klein, I think, used to say it. There's only one taxpayer, guys, and it always ends up landing on you in the end. So what we have to do, there's no taxing our way out of trouble. We have to shrink the damn government. They have to require less money. We have to cut spending. And as Franco was pointing out to us, and as I was talking about, it's inevitable. Like, we're going to hit that wall. We're gonna. Right now, we're just borrowing and borrowing. But the point will come where we'll have to cut. And those cuts are going to be hard. The longer we put it off, the harder those cuts are going to be. So quit looking at new ways to get more money to government. And we've got to find ways to make the government smaller. Easier said than done. I think one of the biggest ways to make it smaller, of course, would be just to chop the West off from it altogether. But that's a whole other show, and I've talked about that at length before. And we'll probably eventually get to that point. But right now, we're still stuck with this federal government. They're still spending like mad, and we've got to try and figure out how to reduce that burden upon ourselves. We got to quit listening to those siren calls, though, and listening to these budgets and this feel-good crap with them spending and subsidizing all over the place. Corporate welfare, I wanted to talk to Franco a little more about that. He expanded more. He was talking about slush funds, but if we keep putting money, and that covers a bit with what Peter Menzies was talking about too, you keep giving money to companies, they don't become more efficient. They don't become better. They don't serve us better. They become just dependent and bloated and don't help us at all. I mean, look at how efficient Bombardier is, SNC Lavalin, the corruption that it fosters as well. We're into an ugly place. As Casey Willis pointing out, 380,000 federal public sector employees are billing us $46 billion a year. An average 121,000 employee. Boy, I wish alternative media paid that well. But hey, keep viewing, guys. Keep buying advertising. Maybe I'll get up into that sort of salary level yet eventually. And that's the only way I would want it to go up to that. Is that we're doing so well, we're drawing so many viewers and so many advertisers that I will warrant pulling a six-figure income. So far, I'm not there. But the only way I could do it with a straight face and with pride and look myself in the eye is if we did it right and we did it through capitalism. That's the only way we're all going to benefit, guys. The only way to keep everybody responsible. Jade pointing out defund the CBC. That's a quick billion. We can get back. Yeah, actually 1.4. And the other part with the CBC is they steal money from the advertising market. And I use that term, stealing it, because if you are getting 1.4 billion a year already, and then you sell advertising on top of it, that's advertising dollars taken away from private enterprise. So it's stolen from them. And that just screws the market up even that much more. And as Peter Menzies was pointing out, of all the corporations that were sidling up to now shake down Facebook and Google and others for more money out of that, why? Why is that bloated pig of an organization that already gets all that money entitled to suck more money even out of the private market while they're at it? Big problem. but we need a giant national change in attitude. Unfortunately, I don't think we're there yet. I think a lot of our viewers here are there, and I appreciate that. But we're not quite there yet. But we got to keep pushing. You know, the only way to assure that you'll lose, though, is to give up. As futile as it feels, as frustrating as it is, as annoying as it is, you got to keep trying. You got to keep trying, and we will. And eventually it'll cycle around. We'll get the cuts. Make sure to squirrel away some money for when that time comes, and make sure you're not going to be dependent on everything. What's that King Dupe 101 saying? That's a lot of chickens and bees. Yes, with our little homestead. I'll be reporting on that soon. My bees are coming. I'm really excited about that in a couple of weeks, I think. And I got my hive built and set up and everything. So I'm probably going to be coming in here with a bunch of welts on myself and frustration, and I'll be sick of beekeeping already. But we do those little things. I'm still going to have to rely on this job to pay the bills. I don't think I'll be a master beekeeper quite too soon. But the more independent we can become in general, whether it's homesteading sort of things and saving money on food and items, or again, just with our employment, that just watch out, guys. If you're dependent on the government for your income, it's temporary. The government will run out of money eventually, and we're moving towards that. And that's what Franco was talking about. That's why he was talking about the 90s, when even Romano at the NDP had to cut spending because they spent too much, that you just eventually run out. The Liberals, with McCritchen, had to cut spending. There was no way to get around it. All right, I think we've ranted enough this week. We got another nice weekend coming up. But next Monday, we've got Jonathan Dennis, and we're going to be talking about the federal leadership race, a little more broad talk on things like that. And we'll probably talk about some of the provincial issues as well. Jonathan Dennis was a cabinet minister in Alberta for some years as an MLA, and now he's back to working as a lawyer again. And yes, Jonathan was the Solicitor General of Alberta for a period of time. It'll be a good conversation. And Rachel Emmanuel, who is our Edmonton bureau chief up there, she's had a week there. We moved her all the way from Ottawa and stuck her up in Edmonton. She got that legislative office there. We're going to check in with Rachel and see how her first week was in chasing our goofy provincial politicians and the stories she's been on and which stories are coming up. So make sure to come back on Monday, guys. Thank you all for coming in today, and I will see you then at 11:30.